Just because fish-eating mothers may give birth to children with smaller brains doesn't necessarily mean their children will grow up with neurological defects. But using real-time functional MRI scans, you can actually see the difference in brain activation in teens whose moms ate a lot of seafood when they were pregnant. This is what a normal brain looks like when you flash a light in someone's eyes, but this is what you see in the mercury and PCB-exposed brains, suggesting toxicant-related damage to the visual centers in the brain. Fish consumption may also increase the risk of our children being born with epilepsy. Does maternal fish consumption have an effect on how smart our kids turn out, though? Well, look, the DHA in fish, the long-chain omega-3 fatty acid, is good for brain development, but of course mercury is bad for brain development. So what these researchers did was look at 33 different fish species to see what the net effect of these compounds would have on children's IQ. And for most fish species, it found that the adverse effect of mercury on the IQ scores of children exceeded the beneficial effects of the DHA. So much lost brain power from fish consumption that our country may actually lose $5 billion in economic productivity every year. For example, our most popular fish, tuna, if pregnant women ate tuna every day, the DHA in the fish would add a few IQ points, but the mercury in that very same tuna would cause so much brain damage that the overall effect of eating tuna while pregnant would be negative, wiping out an average of 8 IQ points. In fact, the only two more brain-damaging fish were pike and swordfish. At the other end of the spectrum, the brain-boosting effect of DHA may trump the brain-damaging effects of mercury in salmon by a little less than 1 IQ point. Unfortunately, IQ just takes into effect the cognitive damage caused by mercury, not the adverse effects on motor function and attention and behavioral deficits. We think that attention span may be particularly vulnerable to developmental mercury exposure, probably due to damage to the frontal lobes of the brain. And the IQ study didn't take into account the relatively high levels of PCBs in salmon, and the accompanying concerns about cancer risk. Adding sustainability concerns adds another wrinkle, as farm-raised salmon are considered a fish to avoid, whereas king mackerel is considered a best choice for sustainability, but the mercury levels are so high as to warrant avoiding consumption, exceeding both the FDA and EPA action levels for mercury contamination. The way I look at it is, why accept any loss of intelligence at all when pregnant women can get all the DHA they want from microalgae supplements, without any of the contaminants, getting the brain boost without the brain damage? Because, as editorialized in the Journal of Pediatrics last year, almost all fish contain some mercury, women who plan on getting pregnant may want to first get tested for mercury. Due to the considerable uncertainty, they show that specific guidelines for number of servings of fish, which are quote-unquote safe for women of reproductive age, may not be sufficiently specific to practically prevent fetal risk. So they conclude an analysis of hair mercury may be warranted before pregnancy in women who eat a lot of fish. It's a simple test. All they need is a hair sample, because mercury contaminates your whole body when you eat it. The reason they're so concerned is because they found that even at the number of fish servings recommended by the FDA as safe, there were women with hair mercury levels above the lowest observable adverse effect level of 0.3. And some questioned the federal safety limits. A recent review from researchers at Harvard and elsewhere on the adverse effects of methylmercury notes that the U.S. EPA limit suggests an adult should be exposed to no more than 50 micrograms. But if that's the case, then seafood better contain less than 0.1 per gram, and current regulations in the United States and the European Union allow up to 10 times as much mercury in fish as the EPA limit allows. And they go on to criticize the EPA safety limit as being way too high itself. They argue that thus, based on new data, the exposure limits estimated by the US EPA and international bodies would need to be halved. So our fish is allowed to have 20 times more mercury than may be considered safe. Increased fish consumption of mothers before and during pregnancy leads to increased exposure to both mercury and the long-chain omega-3 DHA. Mercury may negatively affect brain development in one's unborn baby, whereas DHA may stimulate brain development. As we saw, though, the results of this study showed that the negative effect of mercury outweighs the beneficial effect of DHA for most species of fish. Unfortunately, in the last two national surveys of women of childbearing age, they were less aware and knowledgeable about this problem than other women, despite FDA and EPA campaigns to inform every OBGYN and pediatrician in the United States about the potential risks of mercury in fish. But I wanted to highlight the before, not just during pregnancy, but even before one gets pregnant. Since mercury sticks around, women may want to avoid polluted fish consumption for a year before they get pregnant, in addition to just during pregnancy. The reason they suggest a year before getting pregnant is because the half-life of mercury in the body is estimated to be about 2 months. They fed folks 2 servings a week of tuna and other high-mercury fish to push their mercury levels up, and then stopped the fish at week 14, and slowly but surely their levels came back down. I know a lot of moms are concerned about exposing their children to mercury-containing vaccines, but if they just ate a single serving a week or less of fish during pregnancy, the latest data shows their infants end up with substantially more mercury in their bodies than getting injected with up to 6 mercury-containing vaccines. But with a 2-month half-life, within a year of stopping fish consumption, your body can detox nearly 99% of the mercury. Unfortunately, the other industrial pollutants in fish can take longer for a body to get rid of. Half-life as long as 10 years for certain dioxins and PCBs and DDT metabolites found in fish. So to get that same 99% drop could take 120 years, which is a long time to delay one's first child. What do these other pollutants do? Well, high concentrations of industrial contaminants associated with 38 times the odds of diabetes. That's as strong as the relationship between smoking and lung cancer. Isn't diabetes mostly about obesity, though? Well, these are fat-soluble pollutants, and so as people get fatter, the retention and toxicity of persistent organic pollutants related to the risk of diabetes may increase, suggesting the shocking possibility that obesity may only be a vehicle for such chemicals. We may be storing pollutants in our spare tire like a hazardous waste dump. Now, the pollutants could just be a marker of animal product consumption. Maybe that's why there's such higher diabetes risk, since more than 90% of persistent organic pollutants come from animal foods, unless you work in a chemical factory or stumble across some toxic waste. And indeed, in the US, every serving of fish a week is associated with a 5% increased risk of diabetes, which makes fish consumption about 80% worse than red meat. All fish contain small amounts of methylmercury, the most toxic form of mercury, and fish consumption represents the main source. We've seen that mercury exposure through fish consumption, even within the governmental safety limits, can have adverse neurological and behavioral effects on child development. And severe exposure can cause overt structural brain abnormalities like microcephaly, which is a shrunken brain disorder. But we didn't know whether low exposure could also affect brain size until this new study. Autopsy studies suggest mercury preferentially affects the developing cerebellum, and so researchers used ultrasound to measure the brain size in newborns of mothers who had high body levels of mercury, compared to a control group of women who had low levels of mercury. Let's put that into practical terms. Compared to the low-level control group, here's where the high-level mercury women were. Now, how much canned tuna consumption is that equivalent to? Here's what your body mercury burden is if you eat 1 serving of canned tuna a day, about half a can. Here's what 2 cans a week will do to you, and this is just 1 can a week. So the bodies of the women suffering high mercury contamination in the ultrasound brain study were considered heavily contaminated, but even just a little canned tuna once in a while could bump your levels even higher. So the high really wasn't that high, but still, what did they find? They demonstrated that newborns born to mothers with higher mercury hair levels had cerebellums up to 14% shorter than those born to mothers with lower mercury hair levels. They conclude that prenatal exposure to what may be considered really low levels of methylmercury does indeed influence fetal brain development, as detected by decreased size of a newborn's brain. Are there some brands of tuna worse than others? An evaluation of mercury concentrations in 3 national brands of canned tuna was undertaken recently. In total, they found that 55% of all tuna examined was above the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's safety limit for human consumption. And mercury is not just a problem for children. As I've noted in videos over the years, the health effects resulting from consumption of methylmercury for adults are considerable. It may include central nervous system damage, ataxia, paresthesia, hearing loss, diminishing vision, loss of sensation in extremities, and loss of consciousness leading to death. Due to the increased susceptibility of the developing nervous system, though, damages are more pronounced in fetuses, infants, and children, and may include microcephaly, which is a shrunken brain, delayed development, impaired cognition, and gross neurological disorders. Given the average level of mercury pollution found in canned tuna, they suggest that your average 9-year-old would exceed the EPA limit eating any more than a can of tuna every 43 days. This is not the first study of canned tuna. Previous studies going back nearly 20 years found levels of mercury that were bad, but not as bad as the ones found now. The problem of mercury in tuna appears to be getting worse and worse. But which brand was the worst? National brand number 3 contains significantly more mercury than the other 2, but they failed to disclose which brand was which. They wouldn't say. All they said was that these results indicate that stricter regulation of the canned tuna industry is necessary to ensure the safety of sensitive populations such as pregnant women, infants, and children. There have been dozens of these risk-benefit analyses lately, looking at the nutrient and contaminant trade-offs for fish. Now, fish consumption provides nutrients, but all fish also provides methylmercury, a known neurotoxin. The more fish we eat, the more omega-3s we get, but the more fish we eat, the more mercury we get too. Mercury is a cardiac toxin as well, so while fish omega-3s are decreasing our risk of a heart attack, the mercury in that same fish is increasing our risk of having a heart attack. So studies like this look through the various species. Salmon has less mercury than tuna, but Tuna has less dioxin. As I mentioned last year, the only truly healthy fish in the world would be one made out of dark green leafy veggies. Once upon a time, routine childhood vaccinations used a mercury-containing preservative called thimerosal. I was always surprised by parents who fed their kids tuna, yet didn't want vaccinations because they didn't want to expose their children to mercury. Well, eating a single serving of tuna, which is about half a can, is equivalent to getting injected with how many thimerosal-containing vaccines? 100. A single serving of canned tuna. Sure, dietary exposure to mercury may harm child development, but if we cut down on fish, the argument goes, we may get fewer omega-3s. So these researchers get out their calculators, and in a city about the size of New York, if pregnant mothers ate lots of fish, because omega-3s like DHA are so beneficial to brain development, we would expect to see an improvement in 209,000 years of children's lives, what are called quality-adjusted life years. But at the same time, the mercury in that very same fish would damage 203,000 of children's life years. So they do the math, it comes out positive by a hair, and we hear on the news such and such medical authority says the benefits outweigh the risks, eat fish. Now, of course, this does not take into account the dioxins and PCBs, which tip the scale the other way, but more importantly, why accept any risk at all? By getting DHA from plant sources, we can get all the benefit with none of the risks, all the benefit without the hundreds of thousands of life years of brain damage. This isn't unlike the dairy and calcium thing. Every time they come out with yet another study linking dairy consumption with something bad, cancer, Parkinson's, they get out of saying, stop drinking milk, by ending the article with something like, but one has to balance the risk of cancer, or diabetes, or whatever, with the risk of not getting enough calcium, as if the only source of calcium on the planet were dairy. Where do you think the cows get it from in the first place? Plants. And the same thing with omega-3s like DHA. Where do you think the fish get it from? Plants. And we can too. Tiny little plants called golden algae. No mercury level may be truly safe. This review on the adverse effects of mercury in fish suggested that even slightly increased environmental exposure to methylmercury from fish could lead to adverse effects on nervous system development, just like lead exposure. No lead is the only good lead, and the same is true for mercury. They point to this famous study, published in the Journal of Pediatrics a few years ago, showing delayed brainstem auditory evoked potential latencies in teens exposed to methylmercury as an objective measure of neurobehavioral toxicity in 14-year-old children with developmental exposure to methylmercury from fish. It's a measure of how well the nerves in your brain communicate. You take kids, you stick electrodes on their scalp and headphones on their ears, and play a quick sound, and then just measure how long it takes for that sound to be transmitted from the nerves in their ear to the auditory cortex in their brain. The longer the delay, the slower your nerve impulses are traveling. And so here's the graph. This is delay versus mercury content in their hair. You'll notice two things. The more mercury the kids had in their bodies, the longer the delay. That's bad. Also, you'll notice it's basically a straight line. It doesn't plateau out at the bottom end. The lower the mercury, the better. Where do the official safety limits fit on this graph? In 1978, the World Health Organization started to realize how dangerous mercury was, so they said, no greater than this level is safe. We didn't know any better. Decades later, the quote-unquote safe upper limit was moved down to here. Our government said, no way, our children are much too precious for that, and placed our upper limit here in 2001. As you can plainly see from this later data, though, if you push levels lower, get people to eat less fish, you get even less brain damage. Yet as of 2012, the safety limit remains there. As one former EPA toxicologist told the Wall Street Journal, government regulators really consider the fish industry to be their clients rather than the U.S. public. Depression is a serious and common mental disorder responsible for the majority of suicides. But as I already covered, intakes of fruits, vegetables, and naturally occurring antioxidants have been found to be protectively associated with depression. So, they concluded, it may be possible to prevent depression or to lessen its negative effects through dietary intervention. But not so fast. That was a cross-sectional study, meaning a snapshot in time, so you don't know whether the poor dietary pattern precedes the development of depression, or if depression causes poor dietary intake. Depression and even treatments for depression can affect appetite and dietary intake. Maybe people who feel crappier just eat crappier instead of the other way around. What you need is a prospective study, a study performed over time where you start out with people who are not depressed and follow them for 6 years, and those with higher carotenoid levels in their bloodstreams, which is considered a good indicator of fruit and vegetable intake, was associated with a 28% lower risk of becoming depressed within that time. So they conclude that having low blood levels of those healthy phytonutrients may predict the development of new depressive symptoms. But what about suicide? Worldwide, 1 million people kill themselves every year. In this comparison of European countries, Greece had the lowest rates of suicide. Maybe it's the balmy weather, but maybe it has something to do with their diet. 10,000 people followed for years, and those following a more Mediterranean diet pattern were less likely to be diagnosed with depression. What was it about the diet that was protective? It wasn't the red wine or the fish. It was the fruit and nuts, and effectively higher plant-to-animal fat ratio, and beans that appeared protective. Conversely, significant adverse trends were observed for dairy and meat consumption. A similar protective dietary pattern was found in Japan. A high intake of vegetables, fruit, mushrooms, and soy products was associated with a decreased prevalence of depressive symptoms. It was not characterized by a high intake of seafood. 100,000 Japanese men and women were followed for up to 10 years, and they didn't find evidence of a protective role of higher fish consumption or those long-chain omega-3s, EPA and DHA against suicide. In fact, they found a significantly increased risk of suicide among male non-drinkers with high seafood omega-3 intake. This may have just been due to chance, but a similar result was found in the Mediterranean. High baseline fish consumption, together with an increase in consumption, were associated with an increased risk of mental disorders. One possible explanation could be the mercury content of fish. An accumulation of mercury compounds could increase the risk of depression. We know that mercury in fish can cause neurological damage, such as negative effects on Alzheimer's disease, memory loss, autism, as well as depression. So the increased risk of suicide among persons with a high fish intake might be attributable to the harmful effects of mercury in fish. The big Harvard cohorts found similar results. Hundreds of thousands followed for up to 20 years. No evidence taking fish oil or eating fish lowered risk of suicide, with a trend towards even higher suicide mortality. What about for the treatment of depression? Neither EPA or DHA appeared more effective than just sugar pills. And the same can be said when one puts all the trials done to date together. We used to think omega-3 supplementation was useful, but several recent studies have tipped the balance the other way. It seems that nearly all the treatment efficacy observed in the published literature may be attributable to publication bias, meaning the trials that showed no benefit tended not to get published at all, and so all one saw was a bunch of positive studies, but only because a bunch of the negative ones were buried. Just because fish-eating mothers may give birth to children with smaller brains doesn't necessarily mean their children will grow up with neurological defects.